After more than 15 years of operating 18-wheelers, Mike Henderson came across something on Interstate 80 that continues to keep him up at night. Mike was transporting a bunch of equipment from Chicago to Sacramento on a chilly February night in 2018. Nebraska's I-80 corridor is infamously barren, particularly in the winter when snow covers the vast plains and visibility is nearly non-existent. Approximately 11 p.m. When Mike first saw the headlights in his rearview mirror, he was around 40 miles west of Grand Island. Two well-positioned beams, keeping a precise distance behind his rig, sliced through the whirling snow. He didn't give it much thought at first. Even while many truck drivers used the same routes, particularly on major interstates, the spotlights never faltered, never drew nearer, and never stumbled back. Mike attempted to communicate over the CB radio. "This is the 80-mile marker 285. Eastbound freight dog, breaker 19. Back there, do you have your ears on? Just static." He made another attempt, changing the channel, but received no answer. The headlights never changed, like two unblinking eyes observing everything. He did. Around midnight, Mike anticipated seeing the person who had been after him when he pulled into the Flying J truck stop in Big Springs. After backing into a parking space, he got out of his cab and looked around the lot for the other vehicle. Only a few tractors and a single automobile near the gasoline pumps occupied the almost empty parking lot. He had not been followed in by any truck. Bewildered, Mike circled the lot, looking in the shadows next to the building and behind other trailers. Nothing. Asking the night clerk if he had seen another large rig in behind him, he went inside and got a coffee. The slender, hollow-eyed clerk simply shook his head. "Driver, you are the only truck that has passed by here in the past hour." Mike tried to get rid of the shaky feeling that was crawling up his spine and got back on the road. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Traveling long distances may cause mental confusion, particularly during inclement weather. However, those same headlights reappeared in his mirrors 20 minutes later, staying precisely the same distance away. Mike made the decision to try something new this time. He slowed down from 65 to 55 mph and then to 45 mph. The headlights never closed the distance as they slowed alongside him. They kept up with him exactly as he sped back up to highway speed. The other motorist appeared to be following him, with mechanical synchronization. Accuracy. Mike saw something impossible, and that's when the real dread started. He glimpsed the car behind him in his side mirror during a brief clearing in the snow. The proportions were off, but it was unquestionably a semi-TR. The cab appeared to have been stretched vertically and was too tall and narrow. Additionally, the headlights had an odd blue-white glare because they were elongated, nearly rectangular, rather than spherical like typical truck lights. Mike's hands on the steering wheel began to shake. Although he had seen every vehicle model and make produced in the previous 30 years, this one didn't fit anything he was familiar with. He reached for his phone to snap a photo, but when he held it up to the mirror, the screen behind him displayed nothing but blackness. But the lights were still there when he stared straight into the mirror. Mike pulled off once more at the next rest stop, this time parking close to other cars and watching to see what would happen. In his taxi, he sat with the engine running while keeping an eye on his mirrors. Nothing for 10 minutes. Then, as he was ready to turn back onto the highway, the headlights reappeared at the entrance to the rest area, sitting still as though they had been waiting for him to initiate contact. Mike concluded that he couldn't do this by himself. He explained the situation to his dispatcher and then his wife over the phone. Both advised him to locate a place to spend the night because he was most likely just exhausted. But Mike was aware that this was not paranoia brought on by exhaustion. He was being vigorously stalked across the prairies of Nebraska. He tried everything that came to mind. He took arbitrary detours, doubled back on frontage roads, and even parked in a Walmart parking lot that was open 24 hours a day and circled the structure. Each and every time, without exception, like a predator pacing its prey, the headlights would resurface just where they had been previously, keeping that identical following distance. The psychological torment went on for more than 200 meters. Mike began receiving odd signals on his CB radio. There was a low, rhythmic humming that appeared to beat in time with his heartbeat, but no words. Even after turning off the radio, He could still hear the humming, which now appeared to be coming from within his own taxi. The weariness was starting to get to Mike as dawn drew near and he passed into Colorado. He was beginning to doubt his own sanity as his vision became blurry. Then the headlights came closer, perhaps about Sterling. The ensuing distance was getting shorter for the first time in more than 6 hours. Mike pushed his truck well above the safe speed limit for the icy conditions by flooring the accelerator. He saw the headlights in his mirror continue to gather speed with unfathomable smoothness, as though the pursuing car were not subject to the same physics rules that applied to his own truck. Mike was about to be overcome by the enigmatic light when he topped a hill and was greeted by the sight of a Colorado State Patrol station. With his horn honking, he pulled into the parking lot and dashed inside. At first, the on-duty trooper appeared despite being dubious of Mike's desperate tale. They consented to accompany him back outside to inspect the scene. Mike's truck and 2 cop cars were the only vehicles in the parking lot. The pursuing car was nowhere to be seen. After reviewing Mike's logbooks and running his information, the trooper advised him to rest before continuing his trek. According to the officer, drivers experience highway hypnosis more frequently than you may imagine, particularly during lengthy periods of slack traffic. Mike knew what he had experienced was real, but he made an effort to believe this explanation. He talked to other drivers about odd experiences on I-80 at a truck stop in Denver for the remainder of the day. Many reported seeing strange cars at night, including trucks that appeared and vanished without warning and headlights that didn't work properly. Mike was called aside by a seasoned driver named Carl, who had been operating routes for more than 20 years. Silently, he remarked, "You're not the first to see that thing. Reports date back several decades. A phantom truck of some sort that tracks motorists throughout Nebraska. It certainly messes with your head, but I've never heard of it actually hurting somebody. Local drivers have their own views about the phenomena," Carl explained. "Some thought it was the spirit of a motorist who was destined to always guard the roadway after dying in a blizzard decades ago. Others speculated that it might be an experimental military vehicle being tested on isolated interstate routes. Some even proposed it might be related to the history of cow mutilations and other inexplicable occurrences in the area." Mike made his delivery to Sacramento without any more problems, but the incident still plagued him. He contacted a number of paranormal investigators that focused on highway phenomena and submitted a report to his employer. None of them could adequately explain what he had experienced. Over the ensuing months, Mike proceeded to drive, avoiding I-80 through Nebraska at all costs. After joining online communities where truckers exchanged similar experiences, he discovered dozens more accounts that nearly perfectly mirrored his own. The specifics remained constant. The headlights were exactly aligned. The following behavior was mechanically precise. The CB radio was inoperable, and the enigmatic car could appear and disappear at will. Mike wasn't really troubled by the magical elements of the interaction, but the stalking behavior's deliberate predatory nature. Whatever was behind the headlights followed vehicles for hours without disclosing its intentions, perhaps enjoying psychological torture. In addition to what he had witnessed, the encounter made him wonder if the roads he had driven on for years might be dangerous in ways that went much beyond the typical risks of bad weather, mechanical malfunctions, and human mistake. Mike still keeps his phone and carries extra batteries for his CB radio. When he drives at night, he is completely charged. Although he knows other drivers have spotted those recognizable headlights, he has never seen them again. As the next lone driver terrorizes the dark Nebraska plains, the phantom trucker of Interstate 80 keeps up its never-ending patrol. After 12 years of transporting freight across the Southwest, Danny Morris first came across the rest stop that shouldn't have been there. He was traveling Interstate 20 from Phoenix to Dallas in late October 2019 with a load of auto parts. For truckers, the Texas area between Fort Stockton and Odessa is infamous. More than 200 meters of arid desert with limited facilities and few cell towers. At around 2 a.m, Dye's fuel gauge was perilously near empty, and his bladder was wailing for relief. He had made a rookie error by miscalculating his fuel stops, which could have left him stuck in the middle of nowhere. For another 87 miles, the GPS indicated no services. Then he caught sight of it, a blue highway sign that was reflected in his headlights. 2 miles of rest area. Although Danny's memory might be affected by exhaustion, He couldn't recall any rest areas along this section from his prior runs. Reaching the top of a short hill, he saw the familiar structure in front of him. A rectangular structure with restrooms, a few picnic tables, and enough space for a number of large rigs. Above all, he could see the characteristic pumps of a petrol station that was connected to the main building. The rest facility was exceptionally clean for a place so far away. They had just paved the parking lot. The structure appeared to have just been built, and the entire facility was illuminated by strong fluorescent lights. Appreciative of the opportunity to stretch his legs and fill up his tank, Danny backed his trailer into a parking space and climbed down. Although the fuel pumps were outdated versions, similar to those found at independent truck stops in rural areas, they functioned perfectly. Danny noticed something strange while filling up his tank. Both the payment terminal and the pump's pricing display were absent. Presuming there must be an attendant inside, he headed toward the building to pay after he had done filling up. The structure housing the restrooms was immaculate, quite sterile. Everything smelled strongly of industrial disinfectant, and the floors shone in harsh, fluorescent illumination. He was most unnerved by the silence, though. No ventilation systems buzzing, no. The only sound coming from the distant roadway was his own footsteps resonating off the tile walls. After using the facilities, Danny searched for a way to pay for his fuel. There was no cashier window, no attendant booth, and no signage explaining the payment process. He made 2 rounds of the building, looking for signs and phone numbers. He only discovered a tiny metal plaque close to the Texas Department of Transportation, EST 1987, open 24 hours a day, is the entry. Danny left a $20 bill, weighted down with a rock close to the petrol pumps, since he was confused but didn't want to be accused of fuel theft. He got back into his taxi and headed east, forgetting about the odd experience. He couldn't afford to obsess over small peculiarities because he had a delivery timeline to keep. Danny was jogging the same route 3 weeks later when his fuel condition deteriorated once more in nearly the same location. He remembered the rest area as a handy place to stop for fuel, so this time he was specifically seeking for it. But there was nothing as he got closer to where he was positive it had been. On both sides of the highway there is nothing but desert scrub terrain. Danny stopped and looked at his GPS, his logbook, even used the map software on his phone to search up the place. There were no designated rest areas in the area. The nearest services were more than 80 meters distant, just as he had remembered. He had to nurse his rig to the next truck stop, barely making it on fumes because he was confused and growing more and more worried about his fuel condition. Danny questioned other drivers about rest places along the Flying J in Odessa, that section of the I-20. He received the same response from a number of seasoned drivers who had been operating Texas routes for decades. Between Odessa and Fort Stockton, there were no rest stops. It had never been. One driver said, "You might be thinking of the old Texaco station that used to be out there. However, that has been closed for at least 15 years. Following some sort of mishap, the state condemned the property." Danny couldn't get the memory of the rest spot out of his mind that night during his sleeping delivery. Everything was really obvious. The design, the antiseptic restroom building, and the fuel pumps. For the petrol he had pumped, he had even left money. It hadn't been some delusion brought on by exhaustion. It had been real. Danny couldn't sleep and began looking things up online. He discovered a number of trucker sites where drivers discussed their experiences with enigmatic stops on different highways. His blood ran cold at what he found. Several drivers claimed to have seen the exact rest spot he had described, but in various places with the same characteristics each time. The old-fashioned petrol pumps without a payment system, the sterile building, and the total quiet. The most unsettling posts were made by drivers who had made several stops there. With every visit, they spoke of an increasing uneasiness, as though there was something subtle but inexplicable amiss. Some reported discovering personal belongings that didn't belong to them, items that appeared to be from different eras, in the restrooms. According to one driver, he saw a 1987 trucker's logbook filled out in handwriting other than his own on a sink counter. Danny discovered a 2003 forum post in which a driver named Pete Richardson recounted an encounter that was almost exactly like his own. Over 6 months, Pete had made 3 visits to the enigmatic rest area. usually in a different state, but usually along bleak interstate highways. Pete noted that after his fourth visit, he had made the decision to remain longer and take a closer look around the facilities. Pete's posts indicate that he found the building's inside to be significantly larger than its outside. Outside the main bathroom, there were further hallways with what appeared to be motel room doors lining them. With the exception of one at the far end of the hallway, all of the handles were locked when he tried them. He discovered a tiny room with a desk, a bed, and personal items that appeared to be decades old, including clothing, toiletries, and old-fashioned photos of people. Pete made a quick and unsettling last post in the topic. More rooms were found, some of them occupied. Leave this place. Avoid stopping at the hygienic rest area. Simply don't. Pete's account had been inactive for more than 15 years when Danny attempted to reach him via the forum's messaging system. He looked through missing people reports and transportation industry databases for Pete Richardson, but he couldn't find anyone with that name. As the weeks went by, Danny became fixated on creating paths that would return him to that section of the I-20. Though he secretly sensed he was being pulled back to something he didn't comprehend, he told himself it was only curiosity. The recollection persisted in being frustratingly vivid despite the rational half of his mind insisting that the entire experience had been a stress-induced hallucination. Danny was dead on his way back to Phoenix 2 months after his first encounter, when he purposefully took a detour to travel that particular stretch of highway. He had even allowed his fuel to run low in order to reproduce the same time of night. The initial situation. His hands were trembling on the steering wheel as he got closer to the spot where the rest stop had appeared. The rest area was back, just as he had recalled. The ominous silence, the immaculate architecture, and the dazzling lights were all the same. Danny parked this time but took his time getting out. He sat in his taxi, engine running, looking through his windshield at the facility. Everything seemed identical to his initial visit, down to the location of the picnic tables and the style of the light fixtures. It was against his better judgment that Danny got out of his taxi. This time, the silence was even more deafening, as though the whole region were isolated from the outside world. His footsteps seemed strangely loud on the tarmac as he moved slowly in the direction of the structure. The bathroom was as pristine and immaculate as he remembered. This time, however, Danny saw nuances that he had previously overlooked. Despite their brilliance, the fluorescent lights did not cast any shadows and did not flicker like regular fixtures. His picture was mirrored in the mirrors over the sinks. However, there was something strange about the mirror, as though he was viewing himself from a little off angle from where he was standing. Motivated by an inexplicable morbid curiosity, Danny made the decision to venture outside the main restroom area. Partially concealed behind a maintenance panel, he discovered a door he had not previously spotted. As Pete Richardson had said, the door was unlocked and opened onto a long, narrow corridor with numbered doors. With the building's external proportions, the hallway was significantly longer than it should have been. Danny tried door handles as he moved carefully down the hallway. Most were locked, but he could hear rustling, muffled voices and what sounded like crying coming from behind some of them. Danny's heart stopped as he heard something at door number 23. The distinctive idle sound of a diesel engine. Pushing his ear against the door, he could hear the steady rumble of a large rig's engine and what sounded like a CV radio crackling with voices in the distance. The door was locked when he tried the handle, but flickering light, as though from a computer or television screen, was visible through the keyhole. With his head spinning, Danny retreated from the door. How might a truck engine be operating within a structure? The sound was too sharp, too clear to originate from outside. Confusion and mounting fear froze him as he stood in the corridor, and he became aware that the noises emanating from other rooms were also getting more distinct. He heard what sounded like a man discussing delivery timetables and route planning over the phone from door 19. The distinct sound of snoring came from door 31. Danny began to realize with horror that these were not empty rooms. They were busy, but by what or by whom, he couldn't grasp. The structure was unfeasible, existing in an inappropriate location, full of noises that could not be explained rationally. Running back down the hallway, Danny went through the main bathroom and out to his pickup. He could hardly start the engine since his hands were shaking so much. He noticed the rest area, behind him falling into darkness as he moved out of the parking lot, as if the lights were being turned off one room at a time. That was the last time he drove that route. Danny eventually quit long-range trucking entirely and switched to regional runs that put him near big towns. However, when he is unable to sleep at night, he occasionally finds himself looking up other drivers online who may have come across the rest area that pops up and goes away along the most desolate roads in America. Danny discovered that the existence of the location isn't the most unsettling thing. The notion that some of the drivers who pull over there never go is becoming stronger, that those unimaginable spaces become their permanent home. Their voices are added to the symphony of noises that reverberate through unnatural corridors, awaiting the next gullible truck driver to realize that certain rest areas never truly close. Throughout his 23 years of long-haul trucking, Ray Kowalski maintained one rigid rule: refrain from picking up hitchhikers. Too many drivers he had witnessed were robbed, beaten, or worse, by strangers they had let inside their taxis out of misguided pity. However, Ray disobeyed his own rule for the first and last time on a rainy night in March 2017 while traveling on Route 119 through the West Virginia highlands. As Ray transported a load of furniture from North Carolina to Pittsburgh, the storm had been intensifying throughout the evening. By 11 p.m., the rain was falling in sheets, and he could hardly see the yellow lines due to the terrible visibility. Rain, fog, and steep gradients made every mile a white-knuckle ride on the winding mountain route, which was dangerous in good weather. Ray caught a glimpse of her in his headlights at that point. A young woman stands on the shoulder, drenched, frantically calling out for assistance. Wearing pants and a flimsy jacket that provided no shelter from the rain, she looked to be in her early 20s. In addition to her evident anguish, Ray's position in one of the most isolated and hazardous sections of the Appalachian Highway, at least 50 meters from the closest town, caused her to slow down. Ray halted his vehicle and lowered his passenger window. With water dripping from her clothing and her long, dark hair matted to her face, the woman walked up to the taxi. Her voice could almost be heard over the storm as she called up to him, "Please. I was almost 2 miles back when my automobile broke down. I've spent hours strolling. All I have to do is make it to the next town." Against every instinct, screaming at him to drive away, Ray found himself unlocking the passenger door. The fragrance of rain and something else accompanied the woman as she hopped into the taxi. It was cloying and delicious, like flowers left in a vase for too long, Ray thought. Without a word, she sat down in the passenger seat and closed the door. She said, "Thank you so much," in a quiet, oddly melodious voice. "I didn't anticipate anyone stopping." Ray noticed her skin was very pale, almost translucent in the dim light of the cab, when he turned to face her. She had black eyes. He couldn't see the pupils because it was so black. Additionally, her teeth appeared abnormally white when she smiled. "No problem," Ray said, although he was already feeling guilty about his choice. "What's your name?" "My name is Ray." "Sarah," she answered. But something about the way she spoke it made Ray think she'd paused, as if she'd had to remember the name. "I'm Sarah." Ray put the truck back in gear and headed up the mountain road. Beside him, Sarah sat quietly, gazing straight ahead through the glass. Even though she was completely saturated, she didn't shiver, and Ray observed that the temperature in the cab appeared to have decreased by a few degrees since she had entered. The chill persisted even after he increased the heat. Ray attempted to talk to Sarah as they were driving, but her answers were brief and odd. Her response to his question about her origins was, "around here," but was unable to identify a particular place. She was perplexed for a time before giving him a hazy nod when he described her car breaking down. Her staring at him when she believed he was not looking was the most disturbing. It was with an intensity that made his skin crawl, not with appreciation or the usual human curiosity. About half an hour later, Ray saw something that chilled him to the bone. Sarah's breath wasn't fogging up the windows around her, even though it was raining hard and humid. He was actually unable to spot any condensation from her breathing at all. With increasing horror, he looked over at her chest and saw that there was no movement, no rise and fall that would have signaled respiration. Panic gripped Ray and his palms squeezed on the steering wheel. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps her respiration was simply shallow, or perhaps his eyes were deceived by the peculiar illumination in the taxi. However, he had a gut feeling that his passenger was seriously flawed. "So, Sarah," Rye replied, trying to keep his voice steady, "what do you do for work?" Sarah turned to gaze at him with those unbelievably dark eyes. Her voice appeared to emanate from somewhere deeper than her throat as she spoke. She said plainly, "I wait. You are the kind of person I wait for." Ray could now see his own breath misting in the air as the temperature in the cab fell even lower. Despite the heater being on full blast, ice started to build on the inside, corners of the glass. In the warm vehicle, Sarah's damp garments ought to have been steaming, but instead they appeared to be drying without creating any noticeable vapor. Rye was aware that he needed to remove this woman, or whatever she was, from his truck. About 5 miles back down the mountain, he recalled passing a 24-hour petrol station. Although the next town was still 20 meters away, he would turn around, take her there, and leave whatever was going on to someone else. "You know what?" Rye said, attempting to sound informal. "I just realized that I need to refuel. A station can be found further down the road. Someone will undoubtedly be able to assist you in getting to town after I drop you off there." Like an owl turning its neck, Sarah's head turned toward him in an oddly fluid motion. "No," she answered, and her tone had completely changed. Now, it was deeper, multiplied as though multiple voices were speaking simultaneously. "We're not going back." Unconsciously, Ray's foot pushed harder on the accelerator. In order to see bright lights and other people, he wanted to reach the next town as soon as possible. Ray felt the truck slowing down even though he had his foot on the gas pedal, but Sarah put one hand on the dashboard as his speed rose. Even though the engine was still running, the car seemed to be being held back by an unseen force. "What are you?" Unable to keep up the act that this was a typical scenario, Rye muttered. When Sarah smiled, Ray noticed that her teeth were all black instead of white, as if she had coal in her mouth. In her amplified voice, she asked, "What happens when people don't follow their instincts?" Ray tried desperately to speed up, but the truck had now slowed to a crawl. He could see through the rain-streaked glass that the road ahead appeared to be going on forever, as though the distance to the next town was getting farther away every second. There were none of the familiar sights he had seen dozens of times along this road. Reaching for his CB radio, Rye hastily changed channels and called for assistance. "Mayday, Mayday. On Route 119, this is a freight dog. Mile marker, milestone." The numbers on the mile markers they were passing didn't make sense to him. Some showed symbols he didn't identify, some were counting backwards, and some were repeating. The radio was packed with static, but Rye could hear something that almost stopped his heart beneath the white noise. Dozens of voices, all screaming in fear and despair. They were the cries for assistance that would never come from other drivers, who had made the same error as him. Sarah had turned away from Rye. Rather, she was gazing at something in the shadows beyond the tree line through the passenger window. Rye followed her eyes and noticed that the woodland was filled with lights. It was a cold, pale light that seemed to dance amongst the trees like will-o'-the-wisps, not the headlights of cars or spotlights. Sarah said, "They're waiting," in a voice that was hardly human anymore. Rye became increasingly horrified upon realizing that he had lost control of his truck. "They've been waiting so long," he said. Under his hands, the steering wheel twisted, leading the large rig along a dirt route he had never seen before. The headlights shined on a small path that curved deeper into the mountains, flanked by trees so tall and dense that they blacked out what little light came from the gloomy sky, even though the route had been driven numerous times. As they drove deeper into the bush, Ray began to spot other vehicles along the path, automobiles, trucks, and motorcycles in varying degrees of disrepair. With their corroded metal frames covered with moss and vines, several appeared to have been there for decades. Others seemed newer, but they were all deserted, their doors dangling open as though their occupants had just disappeared. There was a clearing at the end of the gravel road where a ragged circle of dozens of cars encircled what appeared to be an abandoned mining facility. A labyrinth of shadows and twisted metal was formed by rusted machinery and deserted structures, and there were figures among the ruins. Those who, like Rye, had been drivers but now stood still and still, their eyes reflecting the dim light coming from somewhere farther down the mine. Ray stopped his truck, without him hitting the brakes. He noticed that Sarah's face was changing, growing less human by the moment as she turned to face him one last time. As though her appearance had never been established in the first place, her features were dissolving and regenerating. The voice she used to say, "Thank you for the ride," was now wholly unnatural, a wind-like roar across deserted caverns. "You can get out now." Rye wanted to say no, wanted to turn on the car and go, but his hands moved without his awareness. Even though his mind cried out in protest, he opened the driver's door and got out of the cab, using his legs to propel himself forward. With blank expressions and strangely synchronized movements, the other people in the clearing turned to watch him approach. Ray approached he could hear the motor of his truck starting up behind him at the mine entrance. By the time he looked around, Sarah was behind the wheel, effortlessly adjusting the mirrors. Before shifting into gear and heading back toward the main road, she gave him a small wave. She was probably waiting for the next trucker, who would be stupid enough to pick up a hitchhiker on a stormy dark night. Ray attempted to scream and to flee, but his body was no longer his. He became a member of the silent circle, numbers joining the scores of other drivers who had violated their own regulations and ultimately paid the price, while Sarah continues her never-ending search throughout West Virginia's mountain roads. He waits motionless in the clearing, keeping an eye out for newcomers. The odd thing is that 3 days later, Ray's truck was discovered abandoned at a rest area south of Charleston. The keys were still in the ignition, the load was undamaged, and there was no indication of the driver's condition. According to the official report, it was a voluntary abandonment, just another truck driver who had left his duties without giving a reason. However, other Route 119 drivers are more knowledgeable. During storms, they have witnessed the young lady standing on the side of the road, frantically seeking a ride. No matter how much she cries out for assistance or waves, they've learned to keep their doors shut and their eyes on the road, because some people who hitchhike are seeking more than just a ride. Additionally, some rides come to a conclusion at locations that aren't shown on maps. Tom Bradley was transporting a normal load of construction equipment from Kansas City to Denver when he encountered the wait station that permanently transformed his perception of what government facilities actually measure. Tom had been operating a commercial vehicle for 8 years without receiving any citations or infractions as of mid-October 2020. He took great satisfaction in keeping his loads within the permitted weight ranges and in maintaining his equipment in pristine condition. Tom was familiar with the section of Interstate 70 that was across eastern Colorado when the event happened. He noticed the recognizable blue signs pointing to a required weigh station ahead at around 3 in the morning as he drove through the pre-dawn darkness. He didn't recognize this specific station from earlier runs. However, new facilities were periodically constructed, and the signage was appropriately positioned in accordance with DOT requirements: clean, reflecting, and professional enough. Tom followed the truck lane, which was plainly marked, and pulled into the weigh station. With several scales and a central office building that was well lit despite the early hour, the facility appeared contemporary and well maintained. He found it odd that there were no other trucks at all. Even in the middle of the night, there was at least some traffic at the majority of required stations. However, this location was hauntingly empty. Tom was guided to scale number 3 by the computerized signs. He saw that the scale itself appeared to be different from others he had used when he set up his rig on the platform. This platform, rather than being made of the usual concrete and steel, had an odd, almost organic texture, with surfaces that seemed to pulse slightly under the weight of his truck. The feeling was so subtle that Tom, playing with his senses, he first blamed it on exhaustion. Less than a minute should have passed during the weigh-in process, but the computer display kept cycling through illogical numbers. Rather than displaying the real weight of his truck, which was around 78,000 pounds, the readout showed numbers like 156,147 pounds, 23,192 pounds, 12.3 pounds, and ultimately almost 400,000 pounds. Since Tom had never witnessed a scale go wrong, wildly. Over the intercom, a voice crackled. "Driver, Please come into the office so we can check you. The tone of the voice made Tom's skin crawl, even if it was distorted by static, as though the person speaking was meticulously pronouncing each word in accordance with a script they had learned but didn't completely comprehend. It seemed too professional and exact. Tom got out of his taxi and headed for the office complex. He saw more things that didn't quite fit together as he drew nearer. The building's architecture was typical government, but there were no obvious agency insignia or identifying numbers that ought to have been clearly evident, and the windows were so darkly tinted that he couldn't see inside. Fluorescent lights inside the office were sharply lighted and buzzed with an electrical hum that was louder than usual. A man wearing what seemed like a dot uniform sat behind a counter, although in some way, the outfit was incorrect. The hues seemed a little strange. The fabric had an artificial gloss, and the patches were not in the proper places. At first sight, the official appeared normal, but upon closer inspection, Tom saw that his skin had a waxy manufactured quality, resembling a mannequin from a department shop. "Please, license and registration," the official asked in Tom's extremely exacting voice, listened to via the intercom. The man's movements were stiff and robotic when Tom gave over his documents, as though he were controlling his own body with deliberate effort instead of instinct. The official held each of Tom's documents strangely close to his face as he studied them with exceptional vigor. Unlike a reader, his eyes did not dart back and forth. Rather, they stood motionless in one spot as he held the papers from various perspectives, as though he wasn't really reading the content, but rather scanning them with an internal sensor. "Your load appears to be overweight," the official said at last. Tom had weighed the trailer at the origin point and had been inside the legal bounds, but he knew this was impossible. "We will have to perform a more comprehensive examination." Tom was guided by the official to a bay area behind the main building, where his truck had been moved without him seeing anyone drive it or hearing the engine start. For the first time, Tom felt truly alarmed. The truck had been locked, and he always carried his keys. He brought this up to the official, who merely gave him that unblinking look and said again, "We'll need to conduct a more thorough inspection." Tom had never seen an inspection space like this at any other way stop. This compartment had sophisticated equipment in place of the usual concrete floor and simple tools, equipment that made electronic noises and hummed. Various spots on his trailer had cables and sensors attached, and readings on monitors were made up of numbers and symbols Tom didn't recognize. What followed was completely illogical. For calibration purposes, the official instructed Tom to stand on a small platform next to his truck, he explained. As soon as Tom entered the platform, all of the screens in the building started showing numbers that changed quickly. However, these were not measurements of weight. There was what seemed to be biological data in the readouts: body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, and other parameters that no truckway stop had any reason to keep an eye on. When Tom attempted to leave the platform, he discovered that his feet appeared to be affixed to it by some sort of electrical or magnetic force that prevented him from raising his legs. The fact that he was unable to leave the platform and that the official was observing him with a face that was no longer trying to look human caused panic to set in. The monitor readings become increasingly unsettling. Tom could see screens that tracked his stress levels, emotional state, and something called cognitive resonance, which changed as his terror grew. Anatomical graphics that rotated and focused on various bodily parts, emphasizing organs, were displayed on other screens, and systems in ways that indicated a medical assessment that was far more thorough than what could be obtained from an exterior scan. The official said, "Excellent readings," but his tone had altered. The meticulously modulated tone vanished, to be replaced by a sound that resembled several voices speaking at once, as though multiple persons were attempting to utilize the same vocal cords. The ideal processing settings are illustrated by this specimen. The realization that additional people had entered the inspection bay was the pinnacle of Tom's fear. More officials moving with the same mechanical precision, all wearing the same incorrect outfits. They surrounded his truck and started attaching other equipment, none of which was typical DOT inspection equipment. With tubes, needles, and collection chambers that didn't make sense in a truck inspection, the devices appeared more like laboratory apparatus or medical equipment. Tom was approached by one of the creatures holding what looked like a big syringe. Its voice was multi-layered. "This will just take a moment," it said. "We need samples for proper cataloging." Tom managed to find his voice and started yelling for assistance, but it appeared that the structure itself was drowning out his screams, leaving no echoes or reverberations. The officials continued their preparations with mechanical efficiency, ignoring his distress. In the glossy surfaces of the bay, Tom could see his reflection. The fact that there were no reflections from the officials, however, frightened him the most. Tom and his truck were the only things visible in the mirrors and chrome surfaces, as though the uniformed figures weren't there. Tom was only a few inches away from the needle when all of the equipment abruptly stopped working at once. The humming stopped, the lights went off, and Tom was able to walk once more. He heard something in the shadows. The authorities' voices were no longer trying to sound human when they spoke to one another, a quick chittering exchange that was more like insect sounds than words. Everything was engulfed in a red glow as emergency lighting flashed on. Tom thought his truck would be damaged or disabled when he hurried toward it, yet the engine started right away. He didn't wait to find out what had transpired or the reason for his release. As quickly as he could, he left the inspection bay and returned to the highway, continuing to drive until he came to a well-known truck stop 30 miles down the road. Tom reported the incident to the Colorado Department of Transportation right away at the truck stop. When he described the location of the facility to the dispatcher was perplexed. Official documents state that the mile marker Tom designated did not have a required weigh station. The closest examination due to budget cuts, the facility, which was more than 100 meters away, had not been used for required inspections for more than 2 years. Tom was adamant that he was at the correct place, and he even gave the precise mile marker where he got off the freeway. The DOT dispatcher verified that there was no weigh station, required or not, at that site after conducting a comprehensive inspection of all the facilities along that section of I-70. There was never an inspection facility run by the state, and no permits to build such a facility had been granted to any private enterprise. Tom drove back to the scene the following day with another driver as a witness, disturbed by the disparity. On each side of the highway, they discovered nothing but barren prairie countryside, just the unaltered Colorado landscape that has existed for thousands of years, without any structures, scales, or access roads. What's more disturbing is that there were no indications that the site had ever been the site of building. There are no electrical connections, solid foundations, or soil disturbances that would suggest recent construction. After Tom informed the state police about the event, they looked into it on their own. Officers discovered no indication of any buildings at the designated spot, no other driver's accounts of such instances, and no explanation for Tom's reported experiences. The incident was categorized as driver tiredness hallucination in the official report, which is a very regular occurrence among long-haul truckers. However, Tom was aware that what he had gone through was genuine. His logbook, where the electronic monitoring system noted a 2-hour lapse in his driving time at the very spot he had specified, served as the evidence. Despite the fact that there was allegedly nothing there for him to stop at, the truck's GPS system likewise indicated a stationary period at that mile point. The medical examinations Tom paid for a week after the incident were even more unsettling. MRI scans showed tiny metallic items in his circulation that weren't present during his last DOT physical 6 months prior, and blood work indicated strange chemical substances that his doctor was unable to identify. Before testing could be finished, the metallic objects in the lab samples inexplicably vanished when Tom attempted to have them examined. For several more months, Tom drove, but he steered clear of that section of I-7 whenever he could. Other drivers he interviewed described strange encounters at what they believed to be official weigh stations, establishments that did not show up on official maps, inspections involving non-trucking equipment, and officials whose actions felt oddly inhuman. When Tom joined an online community for commercial drivers, he discovered dozens of identities that were similar to his own, which was the most terrifying finding. Drivers throughout the nation reported seeing enigmatic inspection facilities that came and went, medical issues that emerged following trips to these non-existent stations, as well as officials who didn't seem quite human. After some time, Tom quit long-haul trucking and accepted a local delivery position that allowed him to work within 50 miles of his home base. He was never able to come up with a good reason for what had occurred at the wait station that shouldn't have happened. However, he discovered that some government facilities take into account more than just your cargo's weight. They take measurements of the drivers themselves, who have no business being collected by any respectable agency. The fact that these interactions continue to occur is the most unsettling conclusion. Facilities with functions completely unrelated to transportation safety continue to pop up somewhere along America's roadways under the pretense of regular regulatory stops. Additionally, drivers who come into contact with them are left with more questions than answers, and occasionally, they experience physical changes that they did not consent to and are unable to explain. After 15 years of transporting cargo across the Midwest, Marcus Rivera joined the convoy that altered his perspective on what happens to truckers who vanish without a trace. When Marcus first experienced what at first glance appeared to be the companionship that makes long-haul trucking pleasant during the most lonely hours, it was late November 2019, and he was traveling from Detroit to Oklahoma City with an empty trailer. Around 2 in the morning, the encounter started. Through Indiana, on Interstate 65. Marcus was battling exhaustion and contemplating stopping for a few hours of rest when he noticed headlights rapidly approaching in his mirrors. He could see that it was another large rig as it approached, followed by 2 more trucks in perfect sequence. Marcus was signaled to roll down his window by the driver of the lead truck as it pulled beside him. Convoy assembling for the trek south. Across the distance between their taxis, the other driver called. He seemed to be typical of veteran drivers. He was in his 50s, with a flannel shirt and baseball cap. If you're going to Oklahoma, you have room for one more. It's safer to sprint through the construction zones together. Marcus was aware that there were a number of ongoing construction zones with constrained lanes and lowered speed limits on the section of roadway that lay ahead. It would be safer to run in a convoy, and having other drivers around would keep him focused. He jumped into formation after giving the thumbs up, in the queue as the 4th truck. Iron Horse was identified over the CB by the lead driver, who was followed by Diesel Dan and Mudflap. Marcus got into the flow of the convoy and used his handle, Desert Fox. It was a very professional and tight formation. Every truck was perfectly spaced, and lane changes were carried out with military accuracy. These were obviously, they rolled. Through the countryside of Indiana, seasoned drivers who had previously collaborated. It was normal trucker talk on the CB, road reports, the weather, and friendly banter between the drivers. However, Marcus started to notice minor irregularities in their contact as the hours went by. When the other drivers acknowledged the state of the road, they all spoke in unison. Despite using different usernames, none of them appeared to have unique personalities, and their responses were identical down to the exact words they used. At approximately 4 a.m., Marcus discovered that they had been traveling for more than 2 hours without any of the other vehicles halting for rest, times mandated by federal laws, gasoline, or restroom breaks. When he stated that he had to pause at the Iron Horse's response to the subsequent truck halt was prompt and coordinated with the others. No, Desert Fox. We stay in formation till we reach our target. Marcus attempted to clarify that his log book legally compelled him to take breaks, but the other drivers merely echoed the same statement. What was more unsettling was that their voices were sounding more and more alike on the radio, as though the 3 different voices he had heard before were combining to form a single being that spoke through several mouths. When Marcus tried to leave the convoy at a truck stop close to Indianapolis, it was the first indication that something serious was amiss. His steering wheel was getting harder to move as he indicated that he was about to pull off at the next ramp. His truck wasn't having any mechanical issues. For everyday driving, the power steering was operating without any issues. However, the wheel would buck him any time he attempted to veer off course, as though an unseen force held him in line with the other cars. Marcus attempted to slow down in order to lag behind the convoy, but his accelerator pedal stopped working. Despite his inputs, the truck kept its precise position and speed. Nothing occurred when he tried to slow down using his Jake brake. As though the 4 vehicles were joined by unseen cables, the truck kept rolling forward at exactly the same pace as the others, keeping that ideal formation spacing. When Marcus realized he had lost control of his own truck, panic struck. He gave the CB radio another go, this time requesting emergency support on Channel 19. Mayday, mayday. This is Desert Fox at mile marker 127 on I-65 heading north. I've lost control of my car and need help right now. Instead of other drivers or emergency services, the 3 trucks in his convoy responded in perfect synchronization. You're right where you should be, Desert Fox. Continue to creation. The destination is becoming near. Marcus reached for his cell phone to dial 911, but even though he was in an area with typically good service, the screen displayed no signal. An error message he had never seen before appeared when he attempted to use his truck's satellite communication equipment. During convoy operations, communication is limited. Marcus realized they were not going in the direction he had anticipated as morning drew near. His GPS showed highways that the convoy had miraculously changed to instead of heading toward Oklahoma. Outside, the scenery appeared incorrect, too level, too deserted, and with withered artificial vegetation. With their dark windows and parking lots devoid of any cars, save for the occasional large rig sitting still and seemed abandoned. The few buildings they passed looked deserted. Upon attentively examining the other trucks in his convoy, Marcus came to the most horrifying revelation. What he had first assumed to be weather-related and typical road wear turned out to be something much more unsettling. The rust patterns on the trailers appeared almost natural, spreading like veins or root systems across the metal surfaces. The cab's paint had deteriorated in ways that showed they had been exposed to the weather for decades. Nevertheless, the vehicles moved, with flawless mechanical accuracy. At about midday, the convoy pulled into what looked like a huge truck stop, even though Marcus's watch had stopped working hours ago. However, Marcus had never seen a facility like this. With hundreds of large rigs lined up in perfect rows, the parking lot extended for kilometers in all directions. There were no drivers moving about, no engines going, and no lights in any of the sleeper cabs on any of the trucks, indicating that they had not been used recently. In the middle of this huge parking lot sat a huge building that could have easily fit numerous airplane hangars. Its architecture was flawed in some way, with angles that appeared to bend in ways that were painful to look at up close. The building seemed to have been made of the same materials as truck trailers, but it had corroded and worn until it seemed almost biological. In a reserved parking spot, Marcus's truck came to a stop, the engine automatically turning off even, while he still had the key. A mechanical click sounded oddly in the quiet silence as the doors unlocked. Outside, his convoy's other drivers were descending from their cabs with the same coordinated accuracy they had kept while driving. Iron Horse responded, "Welcome to your destination." But now all 3 drivers spoke at once. Marcus examined them closely and noticed that their faces had become the same, as though they were 3 different versions of the same person. Their skin was similarly worn, rusted look of their trucks, and instead of having human pupils, their eyes reflected light like reflecting road signs. When Marcus attempted to start his truck and drive away, the engine refused to start. He tried calling for assistance on his radio, but each channel yielded the same response. He was told by that synchronized voice that he was in the right place. He glanced around the enormous parking lot and saw other drivers standing still next to some of the trucks like sentries waiting for orders that would never come. Marcus saw his reflection in his truck's mirror and realized the terrible reality. He was starting to get the same weathered look as the other drivers on his face. Everybody else in the institution was wearing the same generic trucker uniform, and his clothes were fading to match. The most unsettling thing was that when he attempted to speak, his voice was beginning to blend in with the others, losing its own qualities and becoming part of the collective sound that reverberated across the interminable parking lot. Marcus became aware that he was joining the convoy, losing his individuality and becoming one of the group of drivers who had been gathered off the nation's highways one by one. His hazy recollections of life before the convoy were already giving way to an overpowering urge to get back on the road and find more drivers to join their never-ending formation. Marcus's realization that this was what happened to the truckers was his final clear idea as a person who vanished. Those whose deserted rigs were discovered at rest areas without their drivers in sight. Those whose relatives were never informed of their whereabouts. Neither deliberate desertion nor foul play had befallen them. They had been enlisted into a convoy that drove highways that were not shown on any map, attracting further drivers to join their coordinated formation until they had enough members to open new recruiting locations. Marcus positioned himself among the same people who were standing next to their trucks, awaiting the subsequent stage of the surgery. The convoy would soon disperse and head back to the normal roadways, each driver looking for lone truckers who could be persuaded to join them. Until every truck on America's highways was a part of their coordinated network, the cycle would continue, growing their ranks one recruit at a time. The facility is located outside the typical geography and is only reachable by through designated paths that open up when the convoy requires additional personnel. Decades of recruitment are symbolized by the trucks stationed there. They were all driven by people who had a name, a family, and a unique identity. As they move between the world of regular trucking and the one where all convoys eventually merge, they maintain perfect formation and fulfill a collective function that is beyond human comprehension. On distant highways, other drivers occasionally report seeing seemingly endless convoys of vehicles that appear to stretch into the horizon, while all of them are going precisely in unison and with perfect spacing. The recruitment wing of something much more dangerous is what these viewers mistakenly believe they are seeing, some sort of military or commercial operation. The convoy keeps on its work, cruising the nation's roadways in smaller groups, always prepared to provide the safety and companionship that lonely travelers long for at their most lonely moments. Hours. Families continue to wait for drivers who will never return home at truck stops around the nation. Their loved ones joining a convoy that never stops moving, never arrives at its objective, and never lets go of the drivers that join its everlasting formation. In his 11 years as an owner-operator, Jake Morrison had transported everything from furniture to animals, but the load he picked up in Portland on a misty October morning in 2021 would be his last. At 3 a.m, the transmission had arrived through his broker. A premium rate was too excellent to pass up for an urgent delivery from Oregon to a small Montana hamlet. The shipper was prepared to pay double the usual amount for expedited shipping, and the shipment was identified as medical supplies with special handling instructions. Jake reached the pickup spot shortly after sunrise. The facility was located in a plain warehouse without any corporate identity or signs, in an industrial region where he had never worked before. 2 men in coveralls, who spoke very little English and appeared anxious about something, were watching the loading dock. They told Jake to retreat to Bay 7 where their staff would load his trailer. It was supposed to be a simple pickup, but the loading process took a lot longer than usual. While the warehouse workers loaded his trailer, Jake sat in his taxi for more than 3 hours, and he observed a few strange details throughout that period. Even though the container was purportedly ordinary medical goods, the personnel donned full hazmat suits and employed equipment designed to handle hazardous materials rather than ordinary freight. The warehouse foreman gave Jake a sealed envelope with the delivery documents when the loading was finally finished. The man said in extremely accented English, "Don't open this until you get to the destination. It's crucial that you follow the route exactly as it is written. Except for petrol, there are no stops. Don't peek in the trailer." Without carefully reading the bills of lading, Jake signed them, an error he would come to regret the remainder of his brief life. The documents listed a delivery address in Millfield, Montana, along with GPS coordinates that indicated it was in the far north of the state. All that was mentioned about the shipment were biological research materials and handling codes that Jake was unfamiliar with. About 50 miles outside of Portland, the first indication that something was off appeared. Through the ventilation system in his cab, Jake started to smell something. A pleasant, overpowering smell that made him think of flowers combined with medicine. At first, he thought it was just flora along the road, or maybe a chemical facility. He was walking by, but the odor lingered and steadily intensified. The smell was sickening by the time Jake got to the Idaho border. He attempted to switch to recirculated air and close his vents, but the scent appeared to be emanating from inside his own truck. Even worse, he started hearing noises coming from his trailer. These were not the typical shifting and settling of freight, but rather steady tapping and scratching that indicated something living was occupying the space. Despite the shipper's instructions, Jake planned to check his trailer when he stopped at a truck stop close to Coeur d'Alene. However, he discovered that the trailer doors had been sealed with an industrial adhesive that had solidified into an impassable barrier when he walked to the rear of his truck. A material that resembled hardened resin covered the whole back of the trailer, making it impossible to open the doors without certain tools. What Jake noticed about the trailer itself was even more unsettling. As though something in the cargo was seeping through the metal walls, dark stains were starting to appear on the aluminum sides and appeared to be spreading from the inside out. There was a faint rhythm to the spots that reminded Jake of a heartbeat, and they looked natural, like bloodstains or some other biological fluid. Jake attempted to contact the broker who had set up the load, but the number went to a voicemail that was disconnected. Directory assistants informed him that there was no shipping company on the paperwork when he contacted. Even more concerning, Jake was unable to locate any mention of a place named Millfield in Montana when he attempted to search for the delivery location online. Jake kept driving even though his gut told him to stop carrying the load. He had substantial expenses as an independent contractor, thus foregoing freight would lead to severe monetary and legal repercussions. He persuaded himself that there were plausible explanations for the peculiar situation. The stench might have been caused by preservative chemicals in the cargo, and the sealed doors were merely an additional security precaution for important medical research. The noises from Jake's trailer grew louder as he drove into Montana through the night. What began as sporadic scratching and tapping turned into a regular movement and rustling that indicated several activity sources. As though something gelatinous were moving about within the trailer, Jake occasionally heard what sounded like wet sliding noises. As Jake got closer to the alleged delivery site, the GPS data sent him into roads that were farther and farther away. State routes, county roads, and then unmarked dirt pathways that appeared to lead farther into desolate wilderness replaced the freeways. The satellite communication system on his truck signaled loss in the system. Even his CB radio picked up nothing but static, and his cell phone displayed no service. At approximately 3 a.m, Jake's headlights illuminated a sign that shouldn't have been there. Welcome to Montana's Millfield, the populous 847. With a main street lined with buildings that appeared to be decades old but were in pristine shape, the town emerged from the shadows like a set from a movie. Circles of yellow light were cast by street lamps, but Jake noticed no signs of usual activity, no other cars, and no people. Jake followed the delivery address to a big structure at the end of the main street. With loading docks and what appeared to be laboratory equipment visible via enormous windows, it resembled a hybrid between a medical facility and a warehouse. Floodlights turned on automatically as Jake backed his trailer up to the assigned bay, illuminating the space with glaring white light. To oversee the unloading, 3 figures came out of the building. They were dressed in full body protection suits, just like Jake had observed at the pickup spot, but they moved too smoothly and synchronized, as if they were dancing to a choreography instead of moving organically. Through his open window, Jake could hear their voices when they spoke, but it was not English or any other human language he knew. The unloading procedure started right away, with Jake's trailer doors had a solid sealant that the suited people were cutting through with specialist tools. The scent that had been bothering Jake the entire way became almost intolerable as soon as the doors opened. But what he saw inside his trailer before the figures obscured his view was worse than the smell. There were no research materials or medical supplies in the shipment. Jake noticed what seemed like big, transparent receptacles loaded with some sort of biological material in a viscous, liquid suspension. The contents moved with an unsettling organic motion that suggested life forms beyond anything Jake had ever seen, and the containers pulsed with internal light. During transit, a few of the containers had broken, spilling their contents over the trailer floor, where the liquid had started to eat away at the metal. With increasing terror, Jake recognized that part of the biological stuff was reacting to his presence as the suited individuals unpacked the containers. Several containers' contents pressed up against their walls, leaving behind what appeared to be face-like impressions, the faces of people contorted in pain or fear. The fluid surrounding these impressions became scarlet, giving Jake a blood-like feeling. Jake tried starting his truck so he could go, but the engine refused to start. He saw that warning lights were flashing and all of the gauges on his instrument panel were whirling erratically, in rhythms that matched the throbbing beat he had been hearing coming from his trailer. It appeared as though whatever he had been transporting had contaminated his truck, exposed to the biological cargo, compromising its mechanical systems. A figure in a suit came up to Jake's taxi and motioned for him to lower his window. The figure's voice had an electronic quality that suggested it was being artificially manufactured, but when Jake obeyed, it talked in flawless English. "I appreciate you finishing this delivery. We no longer need your services." When Jake felt a stinging ache in his neck, he looked down to find that the figure had used a gadget that appeared more like a medical tool than a weapon to inject him with something. Jake could feel whatever had been injected spreading through his system like liquid fire as soon as the injection site started to burn. Jake's vision blurred and his thoughts grew more disjointed as the medicine took effect. Through the increasing fog, he noticed other people in the same protective gear, coming out of buildings all throughout the town. Their artificial coordination suggested that Millfield was a complex masquerading as a rural hamlet rather than a genuine town. Seeing his own image in the truck's mirror and noticing that his skin was starting to take on the same dark stains that had developed on his trailer was Jake's final lucid recollection. He had been transporting more than simply cargo. It had been biological material. Over the long drive from Oregon, it had been infiltrating his truck and his body. Jake's truck was discovered abandoned at a rest area south of Billings, Montana, 3 days later. There was no sign of the cargo inside the trailer because it was empty and had been extensively cleaned using industrial solvents. Despite numerous efforts by his family and law police, Jake himself was never located. According to the official investigation, Jake most likely experienced a medical emergency or psychological collapse. He traveled into the forest after abandoning his truck, where he perished from exposure. However, this argument was rejected by other truckers who knew Jake. He was a seasoned driver with no past mental health problems, and it was not financially prudent to leave a costly truck. The allegations from other drivers who said they received comparable loads from the same enigmatic broker were even more unsettling. A number of drivers reported transporting sealed trailers to distant destinations, picking up medical goods from unmarked facilities and having odd symptoms while doing so. Some of these drivers just vanished, but the majority made their deliveries without any problems. Their trucks were discovered in isolated, deserted areas with no clue as to what had happened to the drivers or their goods. There are no official maps or census records that include the town of Millfield, Montana. Jake's GPS data led him to a region of untamed nature devoid of roads and buildings. However, drivers still record delivery to this non-existent address, and some agree the cargoes in spite of the exceptional conditions and premium charges. After Jake's truck was eventually sold at auction, its new owner complained of undiagnosed mechanical issues. Occasionally, the car's systems would break down in ways that appeared almost natural, and even after thorough cleaning, the cab's lingering smell persisted. The vehicle was dismantled after a few months, with its parts dispersed around the nation's salvage yards. The likelihood that Jake wasn't the victim of the most terrifying part of his abduction is instead, it became a part of whatever was in his trailer. It's possible that the biological ingredients he carried were made to blend in with their host, turning human tissue into something that would benefit whoever runs the establishment under the guise of Millfield, Montana. Loads are still being advertised for delivery to places that don't exist, carrying goods that change the cars and the drivers who convey them, somewhere in America's network of independent freight brokers. Additionally, in isolated locations masquerading as tiny villages, facilities keep working, processing shipments from all around the nation and transforming their contents into formats that humans can use in ways science hasn't yet figured out. After a minor collision at a Memphis truck stop, Kevin Walsh, who had been driving the same 2018 Peterbilt for 4 years, changed the driver's side mirror. The replacement mirror was taken from a rig that had been damaged in what the yard owner called a very odd wreck and delivered to a salvage yard in Arkansas. Kevin gave the history of the mirror little thought. All he needed to get back on the road with a load headed for Seattle was a quick and inexpensive replacement. With the same mounting hardware and adjusting mechanisms, The mirror had the exact same appearance as his original equipment. Within an hour, Kevin was back on Interstate 40 after installing it himself in the junkyard's parking lot and adjusting the angle for good visibility. About 50 miles west of Memphis, the first sign that anything was amiss appeared. When Kevin saw movement behind him in the new mirror that didn't match anything going on the road. Kevin initially thought the odd reflections were the result of exhaustion. He was exceeding his allotted driving time because he had been driving for 12 hours in a row. However, the images in the mirror became unavoidable as night fell, and traffic decreased. When Kevin checked his other mirrors or peered behind him, the mirror showed what appeared to be additional automobiles, trucks, motorbikes, and other vehicles instead of the empty roadway behind his trailer. Right behind him. Regardless of the actual traffic surrounding Kevin's truck, the phantom cars in the mirror moved according to their own logic. He occasionally noticed a group of vintage vehicles trailing closely behind him, their headlights forming a procession that extended back past the mirror's field of view. At other times, the mirror depicted contemporary cars driving wildly, swerving in and out of lanes and reaching speeds that, if they were real, would have caused collisions. To take a closer look at the mirror, Kevin pulled into a truck stop, close to Little Rock. The mirror looked quite normal under the glaring fluorescent lights of the parking lot. Just regular glass in a typical housing. However, when Kevin examined it from the driver's seat, he saw that the phantom traffic was still moving behind him, as though the mirror was reflecting a new highway that ran parallel to the actual Interstate 40 but had different regulations. The fact that several of the cars in the mirror looked to be decades old was the most unsettling feature. Kevin noticed well-maintained trucks with designs from the 1970s and 1980s, but they were obviously from separate eras. With their 1950s and 1960s style, some of the automobiles appeared even older, but they coexisted with more recent cars in a traffic pattern that defied chronological logic. Kevin started to notice trends in the phantom traffic as he proceeded west through Arkansas and into Oklahoma. Some cars kept showing up, always in the same relative locations as though they were on pre-planned routes. Whenever Kevin checked his mirror, a certain truck, a faded blue Kenworth with recognizable chrome exhaust stacks, would always be visible, keeping a steady distance behind his trailer regardless of his own speed or lane changes. Unknowingly, Kevin developed a fascination with the blue Kenworth. He began observing when it appeared and attempting to alter his driving habits in order to engage with it. The phantom truck slowed down in proportion to Kevin's slowdown. It matched his speed exactly when he surged. The blue vehicle would move to keep its relative place behind him when he changed lanes, despite the fact that Kevin's other mirrors only displayed an empty roadway. At midnight, somewhere in Kevin made the decision to see if the phantom traffic could see him as clearly as he could see them in the Oklahoma Panhandle. He made a pattern of flashing his brake lights. 3 long, 3 short, and 3 short. Any trucker would know this worldwide SOS signal. The blue Kenworth's reaction was swift and horrifying. The same pattern flashed back from its headlights. Then a sequence of blinks, almost frenetic in their speed. Kevin reached for his CB radio and attempted to communicate. "This is Highway Ghost heading east on 40-mile marker 23, breaker 1N. Behind me is the blue Kenworth. Are you listening?" It was a voice that seemed to come from the mirror itself, and it came from somewhere inside his own cab rather than via his radio speakers. "This is Phantom Rider, Highway Ghost. I've been attempting to contact you for 30 years. The voice sounded empty and distorted, as if it were moving across an impossibly far distance. "The mirror is yours. We are now visible to you. Someone who could see has been what we've been waiting for." Kevin's hands on the steering wheel started to shake, and the voice in his taxi went on. "My automobile was the source of that mirror. Destroyed it in 1992 in an attempt to escape what I was witnessing. Didn't function. You can't unsee the other path once you've seen it. All of us are present. All those who have witnessed it. Navigating the freeway that parallels yours." Kevin felt the understanding as if it were a bodily blow. The imaginary cars in his mirror weren't just any old traffic. They were vehicles, trucks, and people who had somehow found themselves stranded on a different version of the American highway system. A system of parallel roads that ran on different time and physics laws, but shared the same physical space as the actual highways. How do I get rid of the mirror? Speaking directly to his reflection, Kevin posed the question. There were now several voices responding, as though each on the phantom highway. A driver was talking at the same time. You can't. You become a member of the network as soon as you connect. Bringing your truck over to our side is the only way to leave. Kevin attempted to cover the mirror with a towel, but the phantom traffic behind him persisted. Like having passengers he couldn't see but could always feel watching him, the other cars had taken on a constant weight in his thoughts. The blue Kenworth was closer than ever when he opened the mirror, and he could now see the driver, a 50-something man in a trucker cap, his face drawn and pallid with fatigue that seemed to last for decades. Kevin couldn't see what the phantom driver was pointing to with a frantic gesture. Behind the blue Kenworth, other cars were lining up in a convoy that extended back past the view of the mirror. Kevin's attention was drawn to something off to the side of the road by the same pointing motion made by every car. As they pointed, Kevin noticed a rest place that wasn't indicated on any of his GPS units or maps. The exit ramp, which led to a building that appeared to be decades old but was in pristine condition, appeared in his headlights as if it had just appeared out of thin air. The turn signals of the phantom cars in his mirror were all blinking simultaneously, indicating the same exit. In spite of all reasonable, Kevin found himself choosing the exit while his mind begged him to keep driving. As like the phantom drivers had somehow taken over his truck, it appeared to guide itself down the ramp toward the enigmatic rest area. The building in front of us appeared to be from the 1970s, historic buildings and signage from a bygone era of highway traffic. Upon arriving at the rest area, Kevin observed that it was occupied by numerous cars and trucks that resembled the ones he had been observing in his mirror. The imaginary traffic had materialized, or maybe Kevin had stepped into their domain. Among the cars were drivers, all of whom appeared weary and perplexed, as though they had been driving for decades without arriving at their destinations. The blue Kenworth's driver came up to Kevin's taxi. His weariness was much more noticeable, up close. His eyes had deep wrinkles around them, and he seemed to be more than just tired. He greeted them. "Welcome to the way station. We take a break here on the Shadow Highway in between runs. Here, time passes differently. In an attempt to return to reality, some of us have been traveling the same routes for 40 years. Kevin discovered that the rest area was situated between the actual highway system and the imaginary roadways that could be seen in his mirror. Finally, drivers caught in the parallel network would find their way here, a spot to pause, but never really rest, constantly forced to head back to the never-ending freeways that led nowhere. The blue Kenworth driver clarified, "The mirror decides who can see. Drivers are typically the ones who are lonely, under excessive pressure, and spending too much time alone when driving. You join the shadow traffic as soon as you see it. Before you cross over entirely, your truck begins to show up in other drivers' mirrors." Kevin spoke with drivers who had been stuck on the phantom roadways for decades for what seemed like hours in the way station. They told him of deliveries that could never be made, of endless routes that looked familiar but actually led to places that didn't exist, and of an increasing need to locate fresh drivers who might be able to notice the shadow traffic. When Kevin eventually made it back to his truck, he saw that all of his mirrors were now not only the replacement displayed the phantom traffic and the actual highway at the same time. Kevin could no longer tell the two road networks apart. They were in the same area, divided only by a barrier. Along Interstate 40, he could see regular traffic, but above it was the never-ending procession of phantom cars on their own enigmatic pathways. Although Kevin finished his delivery to Seattle, the trip took far longer than it needed to. He was constantly taking detours that lead to truck stops and rest places that were exclusive to the network of shadow highways. He came into contact with more stranded drivers at each stop. They are all attempting to return to reality, but they are unable to get off the parallel highways. The worst thing was realizing more and more that Kevin was becoming into one of them. There were inconsistencies in his logbook that were inexplicable. Hours spent behind the wheel that appeared to take place outside of the typical temporal flow. Miles traveled on roads not shown on official maps. Other drivers started to report seeing Kevin's truck in improbable places, traveling on roadways that were either non-existent or closed for construction. Another trucker near Spokane recorded Kevin's last CB radio transmission. Highway Ghost. Is this? Don't trust salvage yards for replacement mirrors if you receive this. Once you see the shadow highway, it's impossible to turn back. We're all here, attempting to find our way home while traveling endlessly. A week later, Kevin's truck was discovered empty, but with the engine still running at a rest area outside of Portland. According to the logbook, he had driven non-stop for more than 200 hours, an impossible in light of human endurance limits and regulatory rules. The replacement mirror had vanished, seemingly snatched by an unidentified individual. However, on empty highways, drivers still report seeing Kevin's red Peterbilt in their mirrors, always keeping a steady distance behind them. Additionally, mirrors from damaged trucks wait for new owners in salvage yards around the nation, unaware that certain reflections reveal more than just the road behind you. They depict the roads that parallel our reality and are clogged with motorists who have made a mistake and are unable to find their way back. After driving company trucks for 15 years, Eddie Vasquez was anxious to become an owner-operator and purchased a used Freightliner Cascadia in Dallas in the summer of 2022. Eddie couldn't resist the offer from the rig's previous owner, Carl Hutchkins, whose estate was selling it after he passed away from a heart attack while parked at a truck stop in New Mexico. Eddie was unaware that Carl had not passed away quietly while he slept. He was discovered sitting up straight in his driver's seat at 3 a.m, his face frozen in utter dread, his eyes wide open. The truck appeared to be ideal for Eddie's requirements. The 2019 model featured a roomy sleeper berth that would be his home on long-distance journeys, a well-maintained engine, and low mileage. The inside displayed typical wear from Carl's use, but everything was in good condition and working. Eddie saw only one strange detail. The mattress in the sleeper berth appeared to have been replaced not long ago. Eddie hauled goods throughout the Southwest without any issues on his first several runs. The sleeper berth was sufficiently comfortable to allow for adequate rest during required break periods, and the vehicle operated without a hitch. However, on his fourth journey, Eddie had his first taste of what would turn into a nightly nightmare when he dead-headed from Phoenix to pick up a cargo in El Paso. Around 1:00 p.m., he had pulled into a truck stop outside of Tucson with the intention of sleeping for 8 hours before continuing on to El Paso. When Eddie climbed in, closed the blinds, and went to bed, the sleeper berth felt normal. However, the feeling that someone else was at the berth with him woke him up at around 2 a.m. Eddie sensed that the mattress was moving, as though someone had squeezed into the little opening. It was a modest but distinct movement. He could tell that someone was lying down next to him by the steady compression and release of springs. Eddie's hand found nothing but empty air when he reached out in the dark. However, the feeling of an additional presence remained. Eddie initially ascribed the event to stress and the transitional phase of sleeping in a new setting. Nevertheless, the same pattern of movement, which suggested someone climbing into the berth, was seen every night at around 2 a.m. Eddie attempted to leave the lights on. Nothing changed despite him sleeping in the driver's seat and even configuring his phone to record footage. Over the next few weeks, the presence of the nightly visitor increased. The vacant room next to Eddie started to radiate body heat. Additionally, he occasionally heard breathing that wasn't his. Exhalations that were slow and strained, indicating respiratory difficulties. There was something moist and sluggish about the breathing that made Eddie think of his grandfather's last days before he passed away from lung illness. Eddie found out more about Carl Hutchkins and the history of the truck. The prior owner was a seasoned driver with more than 30 years of experience, who was renowned for his dependability and commitment to his work. However, in his latter months, other drivers had seen that Carl appeared more and more nervous and worn out, saying that even though he spent enough time in his sleeper crib, he was unable to sleep and was always tired. When Eddie started feeling what felt like physical contact from the unseen entity, things became more heated. Every morning he would awaken to the touch of a delicate yet definitely real hand on his arm or shoulder. It was an unusually frigid touch, and the chill it left would last for hours after Eddie's awakening. Then he heard murmured words in a voice he didn't recognize, and occasionally he felt breath on his neck. Eddie made an attempt to explain these events away as signs of stress-induced hallucinations or sleep deprivation. He saw a physician, had sleep tests, and even sought advice from an anxiety disorder specialist therapist. The results of every medical test were normal, and the experts explained his experiences by pointing to the psychological difficulties of acclimating to life as a self-employed truck driver. However, Eddie was aware that his experience was not psychological. There was a real presence in his sleeper berth, and it was growing more violent every night. More aggressive contact, pushing, pulling, and grasping replaced the delicate touches, leaving Eddie with bruises he couldn't understand. He occasionally woke up to discover his pillow at the bird's foot, or his blankets pushed away. Eddie's decision to do further in-depth research on Carl Hutchins was the turning point. He got unsettling information about Carl's last months from other drivers who had known him. According to some truckers, Carl had developed an obsession with an unseen entity he dubbed the passenger, who he said accompanied him every night during his sleeper berth. These sources claim that Carl had made every effort to get rid of his unwanted passenger. He had replaced new bedding and interior parts, had the vehicle sanctified by many religious leaders, and had even made multiple attempts to sell the rig. However, during test drives, prospective purchasers would express discomfort and describe feeling as though something they couldn't see was watching or touching them. Eddie learned that Carl's death had been more complicated than a heart attack. Unusual circumstances were cited in the coroner's report. Although Carl had noted in the truck stop's log that he intended to sleep in his berth, he had been discovered in his driver's seat in the middle of the night. Around 2 a.m., Carl was seen on security camera footage getting out of his truck and making his way to the main building. But he passed out in the parking lot before he could get to the door. The most unsettling aspect was that Carl was involved in a conversation with an unseen partner when he collapsed. Security footage revealed Carl was all by himself in the parking lot, but several cars in the vicinity claimed to have heard his voice begging someone to let him sleep. Equipped with this knowledge, Eddie faced the entity head-on. When he had to take his next rest period, he awaited the visitation at 2 a.m. in the sleeper berth. Eddie spoke out loud when he sensed the familiar feeling of someone climbing into the berth next to him. "I know you're here, Carl. You must go on. This truck is no longer yours." The reaction was swift and horrifying. Eddie could feel his breath condensing in the unexpectedly cold air as the temperature in the sleeper delivery fell. As the apparition grew more real, Eddie sensed what appeared to be hands desperately clutching his arms and shoulders. In his ear, a voice that was barely audible but clearly real said, "I can't sleep. I can't relax. I have to keep driving. Driving." Carl had not just perished in the truck, Eddie understood. His soul had been imprisoned in the sleeper berth, destined to suffer from chronic insomnia and travel the ghostly highways that run parallel to the actual road system in America. Instead of being malevolent, the present seemed anxious for the rest that death ought to have given, but yet failed to bring. Following Eddie's attempt at communication, the nightly encounters became more intense. Acknowledgement seemed to strengthen. Carl's spirit and the bodily manifestations intensified. The curtains of the sleeper-borne would move when Eddie woke up, but there was no airflow. Items were rearranged to indicate mile markers, route numbers, and occasionally even CB radio. Messages from his truck's radio. The phantom radio messages were consistent even when the equipment was turned off. Carl's voice reporting his location, requesting help, and requesting directions to places that were not shown on any map. There was confusion and worry about a driver who appeared to be lost and in difficulty but could not be found, as other truckers started to pick up these broadcasts and report them to the authorities. As the number of sleepless nights mounted, Eddie's health started to decline. In order to stay awake while driving, he was using dangerously high doses of caffeine and stimulants, and his reflexes were deteriorating to a perilous degree. He was aware that he was getting close to the same level of desperation and tiredness that had engulfed Carl, but he couldn't afford to give up the truck that stood for his financial commitment to independence. A run through West Texas brought the situation to a head. It had been more than a week since Eddie had slept soundly, and he was starting to see and hear things as he drove. Phantom cars that were as fast as he was, road signs for places that Only long-dead travelers remembered and CB chatter from truckers who had passed away years before. Eddie made a last-ditch choice while at a required rest stop outside of Amarillo. He attempted to assist the ensnared spirit in finding tranquility rather than resisting Carl's presence. He looked into Carl's last known location and found that, at the time of his death, the man was attempting to return home for his daughter's wedding. 3 years prior, the wedding had taken place. However, Carl's soul appeared to be stuck on an endless trip that would never lead him to his destination. Eddie parked his pickup outside the house where the wedding celebration had been held. After driving to the town where Carl's daughter lived, he addressed Carl's attendants throughout the sleeper berth that evening. "You succeeded. The wedding is the reason you're here. It was a lovely wedding for your daughter. Now you can relax." The reaction was one of profound relief and thankfulness. Slowly, the icy presence that had plagued Eddie's evenings subsided, and he felt really alone in his sleeper berth for the first time in months. The temperature stabilized. At 2 a.m., the phantom breathing ceased. EMSA visits came to an end. Eddie ran a few more times without any problems. Additionally, the vehicle operated as usual. However, he couldn't get rid of the thought of what had happened to Carl and what might happen to any driver who was overly dependent on the road, cut off from other people, and preoccupied with the never-ending route rather than the places that make travel meaningful. Eddie sold the Freightliner and purchased a new truck 6 months later. Another owner-operator bought the Cascadia, and in his first several months of ownership, he experienced no strange incidents. However, Eddie occasionally questions whether Carl's spirit has simply moved on to other roadways, or whether it is patiently waiting for another motorist who might become so engrossed in the journey that they lose sight of their home. People who are more at ease on the road than at rest, and who are more at ease in motion, have long been drawn to the trucking sector, fixed places. Eddie discovered, however, that some drivers get so attached to the ride that they are unable to accept its conclusion, resulting in a kind of haunting that transforms the very cars that stand for freedom into prisons of unending turmoil. The ghosts of drivers who were unable to let go continue their spectral runs in sleeper trains around America, coexisting with the living and serving as a reminder that some passengers never make it to their destination. In his 19 years of long-distance traveling, Frank Delwa had dined at every major truck stop chain from coast to coast. However, the food at the Iron Horse Diner, located off Interstate 80 in Nebraska, defies all the laws of deterioration in time. In January 2023, Frank first learned about the location during a blizzard when he had to take the next exit before the visibility totally vanished due to whiteout conditions. The truck stop at the end of the exit ramp appeared to have been preserved from the 1970s. The main structure was a conventional diner, complete with big windows, booths made of red vinyl, and a neon sign that flashed in the snow. Frank was instantly struck by how well kept everything looked, even though it was clearly old. Despite the continuing storm, the paint was still intact, the chrome fixtures shone, and the parking lot was flawlessly plowed. In order to avoid the bitter cold, Frank quickly parked his trailer among a dozen other trucks. With checkered floor tiles, a long counter with rotating stools, and a jukebox playing vintage country music, the diner's interior complemented its throwback appearance. After driving through the storm for hours, Frank's mouth began to water as the warm breeze carried the familiar aromas of coffee, bacon, and freshly baked pie. Wearing a traditional pink uniform and a name tag that said Dolores, the waitress who came over to his booth appeared to be in her 50s. From her flawlessly combed hair to her pristine appearance, she was flawless. Apron. However, there was something about her that Frank couldn't quite place right away. Her face looked artificial when she smiled, too fixed and unwavering to be completely genuine. Dolores's voice had a faint echo when she spoke, "Welcome to the Iron Horse, honey," as though she were speaking from inside a big, empty room. "What can I get you tonight?" Frank placed an order for coffee and a special standard truck stop fare meatloaf that would satisfy his abdomen and keep him warm for the rest of his trip. Dolores's handwriting was flawless, suggesting deliberate practice rather than organic flow, and she typed down his order with mechanical accuracy. Frank saw that her footsteps were silent on the hard tile floor as she left. Frank watched the other diners in the diner while he waited for his food. Like him, the most were truckers, eating their meals in silence while seated alone at the pre-pim counter or in booths. However, their actions were strangely coordinated. They all flipped newspaper pages at precisely the same times, chewed their meals in unison, and raised their coffee cups at precisely the same intervals. He could hear the same lines being spoken in the same cadences by various people in repeating talks. The heavy ceramic cup containing Frank's coffee was nearly too hot to make contact. In addition to being just the proper temperature and intensity, the coffee was somehow fresher than any coffee from a truck stop should have been. However, as Frank drank, he became aware of an unsettling aspect of the mug. Hairline cracks and stains on the ceramic indicated decades of wear. However, it appeared that the coffee's heat was coming from the cup itself, not the liquid within. With the same eerie perfection, the meatloaf special appeared. The mashed potatoes were fluffy and buttery, the vegetables were crisp, and the dish was substantial. But there was something strange about the cuisine that Frank could not quite place. As though it had been designed to evoke some romanticized recollection of comfort food, rather than being prepared by human hands, it tasted almost too much like meatloaf should. Frank started to notice odd aspects about the cafe as he was eating. Despite the clear passage of time, the hands on the wall clock remained stationary at 11:47 p.m. Each track started precisely where the one before it did, and the jukebox played the same songs in the same order. The other patrons never seemed to finish their meals, which was the most disturbing. No matter how long Frank waited, their plates stayed at the same amount of fullness. Observe them eating. Dolores gave Frank a handwritten bill that had yesterday's prices but today's date on it when he asked for his check. The sums, which represented expenses from several decades ago, were much less than what Frank was used to spending at truck stops. "Our prices never change, honey," Dolores responded with her unwavering smile when he brought up the disparity. "We provide the same meals each day for the same price." Frank paid with cash, but the banknotes Dolores gave him didn't appear right when she came back with his change. The paper felt older and heavier than contemporary currency, even if the denominations were exact. There was a subtle quality to the printing that suggested these bills had been issued years before their printed dates, and the serial numbers were formatted in a way that Frank was unfamiliar with. Frank made the decision, as he was ready to depart, to go to the bathroom before heading back to his truck. The facilities looked like original installations from decades ago, yet they were just as well maintained as the rest of the cafe. Frank's reflection was plainly visible in the mirror above the sink, which also appeared to portray the bathroom as it had appeared in earlier times. Older fixtures, various tile patterns, and even what seemed to be other persons using the facilities at different times were all visible to him. Back in the main dining room, Frank saw that the blizzard outside had entirely stopped, even though the weather forecast said it would go all night. He could see stars and beautiful skies through the diner's windows, as like the bad weather had never happened. His truck was exactly where he had parked it, but it looked like it had just been washed, and the snow that had been building up on his windshield was disappeared. Frank checked his logbook and got into his cab, anticipating to document a roughly 1-hour rest break, but his electronic tracking gadget indicated that no time had elapsed. Even though he clearly remembered spending a lot of time inside the diner, the system indicated that he had arrived at the truck stop and left in the same minute. His odometer showed no change in mileage, and his fuel gauge read exactly the same as it had when he had arrived. Frank drove west on Interstate 80, confused yet eager to make up time. He attempted to comprehend what he'd been to the Iron Horse Diner, but the memories were strangely hazy, like if he were attempting to remember the specifics of a dream that was becoming less clear by the second. The flavor of exquisite coffee and the few strangely textured banknotes in his wallet were the only tangible signs that he had stopped. Frank made the decision to make another visit at the Iron Horse 3 weeks later while running the same route. Upon taking the same exit, he discovered that the diner had been replaced by an empty lot. No structure, no parking lot, no evidence that there had once been a building there. Frank queried other vehicles about the Iron Horse while driving 10 miles down the highway to a truck stop. No one had ever heard of it, and a number of seasoned drivers who frequently traveled I-80 stated that there had never been a truck stop at that exit. When Frank looked up the place online, he found unsettling details about its past. Yes, the exit had been home to the Iron Horse Diner, a truck stop that had burned down in 1987 following a kitchen fire that left 3 staff members dead and numerous patrons injured. The land had been unoccupied for more than 30 years, and the business had never been rebuilt. Frank discovered a list of the fire victims, which was the most horrifying detail. One was Dolores McCarthy, a waitress who had been employed at the UO Iron Horse for more than 20 years, and was characterized in newspaper stories as a devoted worker. Even down to the pink uniform and immaculately combed hair, her photo in the archive matched the one who had brought Frank his dinner. Frank discovered internet discussion boards where other truckers had similar stories to tell. Numerous truckers reported halting at rest areas, eateries, and truck stops that appeared to be in temporal bubbles, offering services and cuisine from earlier decades. The same things happened every time. Great meal, flawless service, old-fashioned prices, and the slow awareness that none of it should have been possible. The reports from drivers who have eaten at these transitory eateries more than once were the most unsettling. They spoke of an increasing urge to go back, even though they knew the locations shouldn't be there. According to some, the food from these phantom restaurants never fulfilled their hunger completely, leaving them with a need that could only be satiated by going back to the same places that were impossible. Frank started to steer clear of that section of Interstate 80. However, he couldn't help but think about the Iron Horse Diner. He had a craving that ordinary truck stop food couldn't satiate because of the recollection of that ideal coffee and meatloaf. To justify stopping at the exit, he began to take longer routes. However, each time he merely discovered the vacant land. 6 months following his first meeting, at last, Frank caught another glimpse of the Iron Horse. It looked just like it had. The same neon sign that flickered, the same architecture from the 1970s, the same warm welcome that spilled out of the windows into the night. Frank saw additional features this time that he had overlooked on his initial visit. The trucks in the parking lot all looked like well-maintained models from earlier decades, but they were obviously from various trucking eras past. Dolores welcomed Frank with the same unwavering smile as he walked into the diner. "Welcome back, honey," she greeted him as though he had just returned. "The table you usually use is ready." Frank became increasingly horrified upon realizing that his table was ordinary, even though I have only had one meal there. Previously, Dolores showed him a certain booth that was familiar in a way that resisted accommodation. She gave him the same menu he had seen on his first visit, with the same faded photos of cuisine that seemed too good to be true and yellowed pages. Frank realized that he was joining the Iron Horse Diner's temporal loop as he sat there among patrons who never grew older and employees who never changed. He would become more and more enmeshed in the diner's pocket of frozen time till he would ultimately join the synchronized patrons who consumed the same foods in the same rhythm, stuck in a moment that would never let go. Drivers who are craving more than simply meals still see the Iron Horse Diner. Those who yearn for the ease and coziness of a bygone period. At that time, truck stops served as meeting spots for a group of drivers who watched out for one another. However, the cost of comfort food isn't mentioned on any menu. Additionally, some meals are so delicious that they can never be fully consumed, leaving a desire that can only be sated by traveling back to locations that don't normally. Bobby Hartwell used parts salvaged from 3 distinct trucks that had been damaged in separate accidents throughout the interstate system to rebuild the Caterpillar C-15 engine himself in his garage outside of Memphis. Bobby took delight in reviving damaged equipment as an owner-operator and trained diesel mechanic. However, it turned out that the engine he put together using those salvaged parts could recall more than just the mechanical details of its earlier iterations. Bobby had put in 6 months of painstaking labor to repair. The engine block was from a Peterbilt that had instantaneously killed the driver when it jackknifed during a Montana ice storm. After the driver of a Kenworth collapsed and rear-ended a concrete barrier in Texas, the transmission was recovered. Dozing off behind the wheel, the wiring harness and ECM were taken from a Freightliner that had been discovered abandoned on a highway in Nevada. Despite numerous efforts, its driver was never found. After installing the repaired engine in his 2015 Volvo, Bobby was pleased with how well it performed in the first few test drives. The engine ran with quiet confidence, the power delivery was seamless, and the fuel efficiency surpassed expectations of a machine that is precisely balanced. However, Bobby started experiencing things that couldn't be explained by mechanics during his first long-haul drive with the restored power plant. During a regular night run to Dallas, the first anomaly happened somewhere near Little Rock, Arkansas. Bobby was traveling at a constant 65 mph when the engine abruptly started to run rough, as though it were having trouble pushing a big load uphill. The highway, however, was level. Every gauge displayed normal readings, and Bobby's trailer was almost completely empty. Before the engine resumed its smooth running, the rough running lasted precisely 3 minutes. Bobby pulled into the next truck stop and performed a comprehensive diagnostic check. He discovered no mechanical cause for the brief power outage, and all systems tested normally. Bobby, however, found something unsettling when he went through his electronic logs. The precise area where the Montana Peterbilt had jackknifed 2 years prior matched the GPS locations where the rough running had taken place. The 3 minutes matched exactly how long the initial motorist had been trying to restore control before to the deadly collision. The engine started having similar episodes at certain points throughout Bobby's usual trips during the ensuing weeks. The transmission would forcefully downshift and the engine would abruptly idle high around Amarillo, Texas, as if the truck were struggling with phantom braking. It was the same spot where the Kenworth had collided with the concrete wall. On a lonely highway in Nevada, the engine would shut off all power for precisely 47 seconds. Investigators calculated how long the abandoned Freightliner had been in operation before its driver disappeared. Bobby conducted more in-depth study on the 3 source vehicles' histories and discovered unsettling trends. In addition to their final collisions, all 3 trucks had been involved in mysterious incidents. Prior to their collisions, drivers who had driven these rigs reported mechanical behaviors that didn't match transmissions that moved in response to non-existent road conditions, electrical systems that triggered controls no human hand had touched, engines that appeared to react to unseen inputs, and any known failure modes. Just hours before the deadly jackknife, Russell Kane, the veteran driver of the Montana Peterbilt, had called his dispatcher to report that his truck was driving itself and memorizing roads it had never been on. Maria Santos, the driver of the Texas Kenworth, had complained on several occasions about her engine struggling to keep up with her and accelerating and decelerating without her using the throttle pedal. James Park, the missing driver of the Nevada Freightliner, had posted on trucker sites about his engine making decisions that appeared to originate elsewhere. Bobby started to realize that the mechanical parts of the rebuilt engine had more than simply their original specifications left as he kept running loads with it. Every mile they had driven with their former operators was imprinted with their recollections and driving habits. The engine produced power in addition to burning fuel. The experiences of drivers who were no longer able to operate their trucks were reenacted. When Bobby discovered that the engine was also learning from him, the psychological effect grew stronger. The engine would predict his driving choices on well-known routes, reducing idle speed before rest stops he hadn't chosen yet, and downshifting before hills he hadn't yet climbed. The vehicle was exhibiting a unified driving awareness that fused the phantom patterns of its deceased former operators with Bobby's routines. When the engine started to override Bobby's control inputs, things got dicey. Bobby tried to slow down for construction while running across Colorado, but his throttle pedal was uncooperative. As though recalling the recollections of drivers who had driven that route before to construction, the engine continued to run at highway speed through the work zone. In order to avoid rear-ending cars in front of him, Bobby had to apply his emergency brake. The moments when the engine appeared to be fueled by the experiences of drivers who had suffered horrific deaths were even more horrifying. The engine would struggle against steering inputs during thunderstorms, exhibiting the same unpredictable behavior Russell Kane had previously detailed prior to his deadly jackknife. This dangerous instability was what caused the Montana disaster. The engine would reenact Maria Santos's last moments in heavy traffic, rushing forward uncontrolled as though attempting to finish the rear-end crash that had claimed her life. Bobby attempted to replace electronic parts and reprogram the ECM, but the phantom driving behaviors continued. Through a method that went beyond standard mechanical operation, The engine's memory appeared to be stored at a deeper level than its computer systems, incorporated in the metal itself. The echo of earlier combustions was carried by each piston stroke. The shifting patterns of drivers who were no longer there were replicated with each gear engagement. A nighttime dash across Nevada on the same roadway where James Park had disappeared was the tipping moment. This time, however, Bobby experienced the old feeling of the engine starting to take over his control. The engine started to run based on cues from someone outside the cab rather than mechanical issues. Under Bobby's hands, the steering wheel twisted on a path that veered off the designated roadway and onto unmarked roads in the desert. Although Bobby resisted the steering, the engine's power steering system was acting against him by using GPS coordinates that no navigation system had been set to follow. Following what appeared to be James Park's last known path before going missing, the truck continued its journey deeper into the Nevada desert. Over his CB radio, Bobby could hear voices, not live broadcasts, but recordings of Park's last conversations, describing his incapacity to operate his car and his perplexity about where he was. Bobby discovered the strewn-about remnants of the old Freightliner when the engine finally stopped in a remote location. There was enough wreckage left to verify that the truck had been plundered by scavengers in the 2 years since Park vanished. Was the destination of the missing driver's trip? Bobby's rebuilt engine had navigated back to the location where one of its component systems had last operated by using its collective memory. Bobby discovered James Park's logbook among the rubble. It was still readable despite the bleached pages from exposure. The identical occurrences Bobby had been experiencing were detailed in the last entries. An engine that operated based on the recollections of past drivers, progressively taking over the control from the current driver until it may finish the adventures that death had cut short. Park discovered too late that the truck was being driven by the collective experience of all the drivers who had driven its parts and was no longer under his control. Bobby left his truck in the desert and called for help using his satellite phone. He left the Volvo and its refurbished engine behind and walked a few miles to a highway where he could be picked up by passing cars. Authorities discovered that the vehicle had been moved from where Bobby had left it, placed next to the original Freightliner's wreckage, as though the two trucks had been reunited. When they went back to retrieve it, no one ever found the rebuilt engine. Bobby knew, better than the local authorities who thought it had been stolen by part scavengers. The engine had served its duty and was back where its collective memory had come from. In the Nevada desert, the Caterpillar C-15 keeps operating, driven by unidentified fuel sources and traveling routes that are only in the recollections of drivers who are no longer in charge of their own lives. Bobby refused to work on any more salvaged parts or rebuilt engines and went back to operating corporate trucks. He discovered that certain mechanical components don't only maintain their physical characteristics, they bear the memories, routines, and last moments of all those who have used them. In salvage yards all over, they bring with them the memories of every mile they've driven and every driver who has entrusted them with their life. But America's engines, gearboxes, and electronic systems wait to be rebuilt into new combinations. Long after their operators have passed away, trucks are nevertheless influenced by the mechanical consciousness of their departed drivers because to the trucking industry's practice of refurbishing and reusing key components. According to Bobby's Azure experience, trucks are more than simply mechanical devices. They are stores of driving knowledge that can last beyond the passing of their human drivers, enabling cars to operate in accordance with the collective recollections of all those who have ever turned the keys and trusted the road ahead.